Hey everybody, just a quick disclaimer before I start this video. This one was a really big pain in the butt to edit and shoot. I ended up losing some of the footage and I had to go back and reshoot some of it. So you'll notice that there's a lot of inconsistency in continuity when it comes to some of the pieces. Some of the pieces existed before, later in the video, before the ones that existed earlier in the video. And that might confuse some of you, so I apologize for that. Something happened with the upload and download from the camera, and it just didn't work out right. Also, there's featured in the video is a very small mausoleum, well, not small, but terrain size small, that was old, that came from an older graveyard that I made years ago, one of my first project pieces when I first started crafting. And frankly, it turned out like garbage. I didn't like it at all, so I didn't even want to show it to you in the video. That's how bad I thought it was. And I've since, learned new techniques and better ways of painting and such. So that being said, there is a second video, a companion video to this that's going to be coming out next week, off schedule, that will have feature a new mausoleum that I built. I didn't design it though, and there's actually another crafter out there who designed it, and I copied his design into a template, which I then made. So I won't be publishing that template. I decided against it because technically it's his, even though he didn't publish a template for it himself. I decided it would be better to just leave it at that, and I can post a link to his blog so you can see how he made his. But I will feature it in my video to show you how I put it together and painted it, and it's similar to his, but it's not exactly his. Even so, I think it's right to give him the credit for it rather than to take it for myself. So that being said, here's a video for the graveyard that I built. Enjoy. Okay, so we started off by cutting some 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch by 1.5 inch tall pillars using our foam cutter from some extruded polystyrene. I would later carve a brick pattern into these and place small caps on top that would make them look like constructed pillars. I used some masking tape to hold the pieces together so that I could cut out multiples at the same time. This made it a hell of a lot easier. Then I went in and made some 1 inch by 1 inch pillars of polystyrene for cutting the crowns for the tops of the pillars. They'd be 1 inch by 1 inch by 1/8 of an inch. I proceeded to make my bases out of some foam core. I would have preferred to use some thick cardstock or MDF, but I didn't have any at the time. The foam core tends to warp when you paint on it, and I'll deal with that later, as I'll show you. Here I'm just gauging where I want my pillars to be for my gate that I was going to make. I made my bases roughly 1.5 inches wide. The gate was 8 inches long. I decided that that was a good length for a gate piece. Here in these shots, my bald head aside, where I'm just etching in some brick pattern using my preferred method of cutting and then using a ballpoint pen. I'm repeating the same thing on the crowns. Drawing in a simple brick pattern on the top. Here I'm just measuring center on my foam core and relaying the positioning, since I forgot to mark them before when I was actually cutting it out. I placed them roughly at 2-inch intervals for the outer pieces, and with a 3-inch gap roughly in the center for the gate. Here I'm just using some barbecue skewers to make holes in the foam and then hot gluing it all together. And these will be the rails for the fence. I saved some time by using the hot glue on this version, but I would have preferred to had used the PVA glue. It would have looked a lot better in the end. I did this for time, since I had to since this was all reshot footage. I didn't want to spend too much time redoing something I had already done. Here I'm cutting out some wooden braces using paint stirrers from my big box store. These didn't really require any specific kind of a shape, and in the end I wish I had done a little bit better job on these two. They ended up splitting and warping. It did come out okay, but I should have drilled holes in them rather than try to rest the pieces up against. My plan, like the original gate, was to use drinking straws wrapped around some pieces of wooden dowel. And I made the pieces here a little too long, and I had to come back and trim them up later on. I just used the end of some barbecue skewers for the gate, and I laid some coffee stirrers across the top and the bottom for banding, just using some super glue to hold them all together, and ended up working out pretty well. I made the gate roughly the size of the opening that I have on the base, but just a little shorter to accommodate the opening, and I still didn't quite get it right. The way that I had the gate open, I should have put the hinges on the exact side. I ended up putting them on the back to try to mimic what I did on the original gate, and it wasn't quite to my liking, which you'll see in a minute here when I actually attach the gate to the base. I just come in and trim off the excess. And it's at this point I would recommend trimming the bottom too. I had some issue with the bottom scraping against the finished terrain piece that I had to go back in later and trim, which was difficult at best. Here I'm just attaching the drinking straws to the backs of the gate using some hot glue. And just reinforcing it with a little more glue. Cutting off some small details from some coffee stir sticks and using those for the side of the door. We did have a little breakage. I didn't wait quite long enough for my super glue to dry. Right here you can see I'm poking a hole using a barbecue skewer to find the spot where I actually want the door to sit. And then I'll go back in a minute and bore out the hole using my hobby knife before inserting the dowel. And this is where, if I had put the hinges on the exact sides of the gates and made the gate a little smaller or made the opening a little wider, it would have looked a lot better. Even if I had made the gate only open on one side, and then I could have made the top portion of the retainer a lot less of a hassle, which you'll see here momentarily. The effect achieved, though, ended up being quite nice, although this gate is a lot more flimsy than the original. It serves its purpose, and it looks pretty alright when finished. I'm just trimming up the drinking straw a little bit, as it was just a tad too long. None of my measurements on this were quite right. It was, like I said, just one of those nightmare projects that never wanted to finish and never wanted to get edited. It was difficult. I'm just marking out where I'm going to put my my holes for the hinges. However, the wood ended up splitting when I started cutting into it, and I should have just drilled out the holes. Like I said, if it had been centered, it would have been easier, and I ended up making a retainer nonetheless, just using some super glue and hot glue, and it did work out in the end, but I would have done it a lot differently if I did it again. I don't know how I did the first one without this issue, but the first one came out a lot better and didn't have as many issues. Happy accidents, I suppose. I had to come back in and trim up the dowels, which ended up breaking them free from the super glue, so I had to re-glue them, and I gave up and started just using hot glue at this point. Putting on the crowns, and I'm noticing the gates, when they open, are going to hit the crown, so I had to cut out a piece of the crown in order to accommodate the gate, otherwise the gate wouldn't close. So I opened the gate to make an indent in the crown, and that was how I got my pattern. You can see here I'm reattaching one of the hinges that broke off. And this is what I meant when I said I had to come back in and trim the bottom of it, because it kept scraping against the bottom of the piece. And I had to come back in and do it again later after flocking. The gate didn't want to sit quite straight. The drinking straw ended up being a little too loose for the dowel on this one, on this version. Here I trimmed up some fence posts using coffee stir sticks. I figured this was the best bet, and I didn't want to keep reusing the same materials, the same barbecue skewers to make pointed ones. Also, I didn't have that many left, so I didn't want to use them all up. The hot glue made this quick, but again, I would have preferred to use the PVA glue. I tried to use my hobby knife to bevel the edges on this, but my hobby knife ended up getting really dull at this point, so I stopped using that and went right for my big cutter, which worked out okay. At this point, I realized I would have been better off beveling the edges before gluing everything on. I came back afterwards and sanded the bottom to make it flush. Now we're moving on to make some fence pieces. I made some corners, and I made some straight pieces. I made one long straight piece and 5 or 6 smaller straight pieces. The straight pieces were roughly 3 inches long and 6 inches long respectively, and the corners were 3 by 3. And I used the same technique that I used on the gate to put in the braces. Again, just hot gluing them together. This saved a buttload of time, but the wisps, my God, the wisps. Just coming in to finish up by attaching the crowns. You'll notice that at this point, when I switch to the painting, you'll start to see some of the pieces that I made. This is where you start to see the footage change from the recovered footage back to the original. The crowns on the original pieces, I didn't do the detail work that I did on the second pieces. There's an inconsistency there. So after beveling the bottoms of the bases, I came in with some PVA glue and attached some pieces of bricking to look like rubble along the sides. Gives the appearance that a mason is still on site, perhaps doing some repair work, or that there was some damage to the gates. And now I'm basing the whole bottom in PVA glue and covering it in some white sand that I got from the dollar store. And this will be my primary texture before doing the rest of the flocking and terrain work on the bottom. I like this white sand. It was cheap and it offered a nice, it offers a nice texture. Next, I came in and decided to paint the bottoms of these pieces using the my preferred method, which Jeremy from Black Magic Craft uses. It's the black paint with Mod Podge, and I painted the bases because these have a tendency to warp when you paint them, especially on foam core. So I came in and put a nice thick coat on the bottoms, which actually warped them downwards before priming, which was perfect because afterwards, here, as seen there, all black bombed and ready to go. I'm doing a dry brush of my pewter gray on the base, and then coming back in with a dry brush of granite gray. This ended up making the terrain pieces warp back the other direction and centered them, flattened them. Here you can see the original gate being painted. I painted the bars using a gunmetal gray. And then a dry brush of silver. After that, I came in and gave everything a wash with black. I decided the graveyard gate needed some detail, so I took some of these Pathfinder miniatures that I had. I had a whole set of undead. I decided to take these two ghoulish looking things and turn them into statues perched atop the edges. But before that, I noticed it needed a little more detail, so I gave it a sponging with 2 different colors of green to look like moss. Here you can see the gate mostly finished. I put some rings for detail around the latches before attaching the gargoyles. And then I gave them a liberal coating in the black Mod Podge as well. I just super glued these to the top. I didn't bother using hot glue. I figured it would have been too messy. And here I'm just placing some clump foliage to look like piles of leaves and brush scattered around the outside. And I sealed it with some watered down PVA glue. And also added some grass. Here you can see the piece finished and the gate opening. This was the original one. Like I said, this one was way tighter and it came out way better, I think, than the remade version. And the gargoyles needed some dry brushing, so I gave them a dry brushing with granite gray, and I came over then with a black wash. There you go. There's the finished product, along with some graveyard set pieces that I got from Michael's around Halloween time. There you can see the second mausoleum. That will be part 2 of the video coming next week, as well as a instructional on what not to do when finishing a model. And that brings us to the end of another video. Stay tuned next week for part 2, where I build the mausoleum. And if you like the video, please hit the like button and subscribe. And if you feel like I've done a good job, help support me on Patreon. I'd really appreciate it. Every dollar that I get will go back into making cooler videos and cooler terrain pieces. So I'll reinvest it in the channel. So thanks for watching.